The zipper's rasp was the only sound in the sterile, windowless room. It was a harsh metallic tear, a violation. Captain Eva Rostova sat perfectly still in the cold metal chair, her hands resting on her knees, back straight as the soldier she was. Her gaze, a flat, unreadable gray, was fixed on the two men methodically dismantling her life. They were internal affairs, their faces carved from the same granite as the statues in front of the Pentagon. They had met her on the tarmac, the smell of jet fuel still clinging to her desert camouflage uniform, and escorted her here without a word. The lead investigator, a man whose nameplate read Fletcher, worked with a cold, surgical precision. His partner, younger, with a nervous tick in his jaw, mirrored his movements. They were emptying her backpack, the same one that had been with her from the sands of Iraq to the mountains of Afghanistan, and now, just hours ago, the dust of a covert outpost in Syria. It was more than a bag. It was a repository of her career, a timeline written in dust, sweat, and small, personal artifacts. Fletcher laid each item on the steel table with a soft, definitive thud. A dog-eared copy of For Whom the Bell Tolls, its spine cracked from countless rereadings in distant lands. A canteen still half full with tepid water. A standard-issue first aid kit, its contents meticulously restocked. A spare uniform neatly folded, the fabric still holding the faint, acrid scent of smoke and desert. Each object was a piece of a puzzle they were trying to force into a picture of betrayal. They were looking for contraband, for secrets sold, for a reason a decorated military intelligence officer would turn. They were hunting for a ghost, and in doing so, they were about to stumble upon a ghost's memorial. Eva's face was a mask of professional composure, but her mind was a whirlwind. Every item they touched carried a memory. The book was a gift from her father, a retired general who had told her every soldier needs an escape. The canteen had been with her when her convoy was ambushed outside Fallujah. The uniform was the one she'd been wearing when she received the news about Liam. She watched Fletcher's hands, his thick fingers probing the seams of the pack, searching for a hidden compartment, a false bottom. He found nothing but fabric and dust. He upended the main compartment, giving it a firm shake. A few granules of sand from a world away scattered across the polished steel, and then it fell. A small rectangular object, swaddled in a black socks for protection. It hit the table with a soft, muffled thump that seemed deafening in the quiet room. Fletcher paused, his eyes narrowing. This was not standard issue. This was personal. He unwrapped the sock, his movements slowing, his focus intensifying. The younger investigator leaned in slightly, his curiosity overriding his professional detachment. There, in Fletcher's palm, lay a small velvet box. It was a deep royal blue, the fabric worn soft at the corners from years of handling. It was the kind of box made for holding precious things, for promises and heirlooms. This was not what they were looking for. This was something else entirely. Fletcher's thumb rested on the small brass clasp. He glanced at Ava, a question in his eyes, but her expression had not changed. She simply watched him, her gaze steady, a deep, unfathomable sorrow swimming just beneath the surface of her calm. He clicked the box open. The inside was lined with faded cream-colored silk, and there, nestled perfectly in its impression, was a medal. But it was all wrong. It was not the familiar bronze star of the service medals, nor the eagle of the Distinguished Service Medal. This was something entirely different, something unofficial, something private. It was a silver star, beautifully crafted, but it was encircled by a delicate laurel wreath. And at its center, where a traditional medal might have a symbol of the nation, was a single dark blue sapphire that seemed to swallow the room's harsh fluorescent light. It was stunning, and it was utterly, completely unauthorized. Fletcher's professional composure shattered. His breath caught in his throat. He had seen every decoration the United States military could bestow. He had files memorized, protocols ingrained. This did not exist. The younger investigator stared, his mouth slightly agape. The air in the room grew thick, heavy with a new, unspoken question. The hunt for a traitor had suddenly, inexplicably ended. They were now in the presence of a mystery, a secret history laid bare on a cold steel table, and they had no map to read it. The silence in the room was no longer merely quiet. It was profound, a heavy blanket that smothered sound and thought. Fletcher's eyes were locked on the object in the box. His mind, a well-oiled machine designed to categorize and assess, scrambled for a reference point and found none. This wasn't just an unauthorized medal. It was a ghost. The design was too intricate, too specific to be some cheap trinket. The silver star was polished to a mirror shine, the laurel wreath around it crafted with a jeweler's precision. And that stone, a deep, dark sapphire that seemed to hold a tiny, captured piece of the night sky. It was beautiful, and its very existence in the possession of a returning covert operator was deeply unsettling. His partner, Agent Miller, broke the stillness with a sharp, incredulous whisper. "What in God's name is that?" Fletcher didn't answer. He carefully, almost reverently, lifted the medal from its velvet cradle. It was heavier than it looked, solid and cold in his palm. He turned it over. There were no official inscriptions on the back. No for valor or for distinguished service. Instead, etched in a fine, elegant script, were two words: foresight, loyalty. And below that, a set of coordinates and a date. Fletcher's blood ran cold. He recognized the date instantly. It was the date of the Operation Iron Veil ambush in the Kunar province, a black mark in the Special Operations community, an event that was still discussed in hushed, pained tones within the halls of Jayasok. He looked from the medal in his hand to the woman across the table. Captain Rostova had not moved a muscle, but something in her face had shifted. The defensive wall was still there, but behind it, he saw a flicker of profound pain, a raw grief that was so fresh it seemed to suck the warmth from the room. This was not the face of a traitor. This was the face of a soldier holding a ghost. "Captain," Fletcher said, his voice uncharacteristically soft, the official tone gone. "You need to explain this." "This is not a regulation award." "Where did you get it?" Ava's eyes remained fixed on the medal in his hand. She could see the faint reflection of the overhead light in its polished surface. For a long moment she said nothing, lost in the memory that small, cold piece of metal represented. She remembered the weight of it when it was first placed in her hand. The rough, calloused fingers of the giver, the smell of dust and regret that had filled the air that day. She took a slow, measured breath, the kind you take before stepping off a ledge. "It was a private commission," she began, her voice low but clear, devoid of its earlier defensive edge. It was now just a vessel for a story, a heavy story that had been buried for years. It was never meant for anyone else to see. It's not in any record. It doesn't exist in any personnel file. She finally lifted her gaze to meet Fletcher's. "They called it the Medal of Foresight." The name hung in the air, strange and poignant. Fletcher's investigative mind, now sidelined by a deeper human curiosity, urged him to remain silent, to let her talk. He carefully placed the medal back in its box, as if handling a holy relic, and slid it to the center of the table, a silent invitation for her to continue. The investigation into smuggling or treason was over. Now, they were bearing witness to a confession of a different kind. A story of a debt paid not by a nation, but by a band of brothers to the one person who had tried to save their own. The memory came not as a gentle wave, but as a sudden, violent immersion. The sterile interrogation room dissolved, replaced by the oppressive, dry heat of a forward operating base in the Kunar province. The year was 2012. The air didn't just feel hot. It tasted of dust and diesel fuel. Sergeant Ava Rostova, then just 24, sat on a folding chair inside a plywood shack, a pair of heavy headphones sealing her off from the world outside. A bank of radios and recording equipment hummed before her, her weapons in this war. The faint, tinny sound of a distant conversation crackled in her ears, a stream of Pashto she was translating in real time, her fingers a blur over a dusty keyboard. She was good at her job. Scary good. It wasn't just about vocabulary and grammar. It was about the music of the language, the subtle shifts in dialect, the unspoken meaning hiding between the words. It was a puzzle, and she was the one who could see the picture taking shape before anyone else. The shack door was open, offering a sliver of a view of the rugged, unforgiving mountains that hid 100 unseen enemies. She saw Sergeant Liam Crow walk by, his medic bag slung over his shoulder, laughing at something one of his ODA team members had said. He had an easy smile that seemed out of place in all that dust and danger. He caught her eye through the doorway and gave her a quick, casual salute, a gesture of recognition between two soldiers living in different worlds within the same wire. She had offered a small, shy smile in return before turning back to her console, the brief human connection a spark in the isolation. The voice in her headphones changed. The target, a high-value Taliban facilitator they had been tracking for weeks, was speaking. But something was off. The man was supposed to be from a village in Helmand, but his dialect, the specific colloquialisms he used, they were pure Paktika. It was a subtle difference, one that could easily be missed, like someone from Boston trying to mimic a Texan drawl and getting it just slightly wrong. A cold knot tightened in her stomach. She listened more intently, her pen scratching notes on a pad. He was giving a location, confirming a meeting, but the linguistic dissonance was a screaming alarm bell in her mind. This wasn't a confirmation. It was a performance. She ripped the headphones off, the sudden silence ringing in her ears. She grabbed her notepad and burst out of the shack, the bright sunlight momentarily blinding her. She found her commander, Captain Evans, standing near a Humvee studying a map. "Sir," she said, her voice tight, "we have a problem with the Iron Veil intel." She held out her notepad, pointing to her scrawled phonetic notations. "The dialect is wrong, sir. It's Paktika, not Helmand. The syntax is all off. This feels staged. It feels like an ambush." Captain Evans glanced from the notepad to her face, his expression one of mild annoyance. "Rostova, the signal intelligence is solid. The geolocation matches. We're not going to scrub a mission because of a hunch about a regional accent." "It's not a hunch, sir," she insisted, her voice rising with a desperate urgency. "It's a pattern. It's a trap." He shook his head, a firm, final gesture. "The decision is made. The team is already gearing up. Stand down, Sergeant." He walked away, leaving her standing there, the notepad feeling like a lead weight in her hand. She turned and saw Liam Crow and his team, their faces painted with a focused intensity, checking their gear, doing one last weapons check. They were loading up. They were going in. And she had just failed to stop it. The roar of the departing Black Hawk helicopters was a physical vibration in her chest, a sound that felt like a final verdict. Ava stood rooted to the spot, the dust from the rotor wash settling on her uniform like a shroud. The notepad, with its damning linguistic evidence, was still clutched in her white-knuckled hand. She watched the two birds become specks against the harsh blue of the Afghan sky, their thumping rotors fading into the whisper of the mountain wind. The silence they left behind was worse than the noise. It was a silence filled with the echo of her own failure. She had spoken the truth, but her voice had been too small, her evidence too abstract against the solid certainty of a map and a signal trace. Back inside the plywood shack, the headphones felt like a betrayal. She put them on, her hands trembling, and tuned her receiver to the team's operational frequency. The air was filled with the calm, professional chatter of men moving into position. She heard Liam's voice, clear and steady, reporting their landing zone was clear. Every word was a fresh cut. She was now a spectator to the disaster she had foreseen, forced to listen to the opening acts of a tragedy. She closed her eyes, trying to will a different reality into existence, but the crackle of the radio was an anchor dragging her back into the nightmare. The team moved through the target village, their reports concise. "Building Alpha clear." Moving to Structure Bravo. The tension was a wire stretching tighter and tighter in the quiet. Then, the world exploded. The radio erupted in a burst of static and frantic overlapping shouts. "Contact front! Heavy fire!" They were waiting. They were waiting. The sharp, percussive blast of an RPG tore through the frequency, followed by a scream that was cut horrifically short. Ava's blood turned to ice. She could hear the distinct sound of PKM machine guns and the sharper retort of the team's M4s. It was a kill zone. Captain Evans was suddenly in the command center, his face pale, his earlier confidence shattered. "What's their status? Get me a sitrep," he barked into his own headset. The voice that came back was Liam's, but it was strained, tight with pain and effort. "Multiple wounded. We're pinned down! Watson is hit bad, Garcia's down. We need immediate extract now. Eva listened, her translator's mind piecing together the horrifying picture from the chaos of sound. She could hear Liam in the background, his voice a constant, calming presence amidst the storm of gunfire. "I've got you, brother, I've got you," he was saying to one of the wounded. "Just hold on." Then a new sound. The distinctive hollow thump of a grenade launcher. A voice screamed, "Grenade!" There was a moment of suspended silence, a single heartbeat in time, and then the transmission was filled with a deafening blast and a burst of white noise. When the audio cleared, Liam's voice was gone. Another voice, ragged and broken, came on. "Medic is down! Crow is down! He jumped on it. He took the blast." The words landed on Eva with the force of a physical blow. She slumped forward, the headphones slipping from her ears and clattering onto the console. The room swam around her. The ambush was no longer an abstract concept. It was a reality painted in the blood of the men on the ground, sealed by the ultimate sacrifice of the medic, with the easy smile. The intelligence had been solid, the location perfect. The only thing that had been wrong was the truth she had tried to tell, a truth that was now buried under the rubble of a broken mission and the weight of a good man's body. The days that followed were a blur of muted sounds and gray grief. The official notification, the somber faces, the memorial service held inside the wire where boots, rifles, and helmets stood in a silent, terrible line. Ava attended, standing at the back, her uniform feeling like a costume. She felt the weight of the unspoken truth pressing down on her, a secret she shared only with the ghosts of the ambush. She had tried to stop it, and she had failed. The guilt was a cold stone in her gut. She avoided the eyes of the surviving team members, seeing the hollowed-out pain in their faces and feeling responsible for etching it there. Weeks later, the base was beginning to return to its grim version of normal. The war, indifferent to individual loss, continued. Ava was walking back from the comms center, her head down, when a figure stepped into her path. It was Master Sergeant Donovan, the team leader of the decimated ODA. He was a mountain of a man, his face now etched with new lines of sorrow, his eyes holding a grief so profound it was almost peaceful. He looked at her, really looked at her, and she braced for the accusation, the blame she knew she deserved. "Sergeant Rostova," he said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble, devoid of anger. He didn't say anything else for a long moment, just held her gaze. Then he slowly reached into the pocket of his fatigues. He pulled out a small velvet box, the same deep blue one that now lay on the interrogation table a decade later. "The team," he began, his voice catching slightly. He cleared his throat, his jaw tightening. "The team, what's left of us. We had this made." He pressed the box into her hand. Her fingers closed around it, numb with shock. She opened it slowly. The silver star with the laurel wreath and the dark sapphire gleamed up at her, beautiful and heartbreaking. "We call it the Medal of Foresight," Donovan continued, his eyes glistening. "Liam talked about you, said you were the sharpest ear in the country, said if you ever said something was wrong, a smart man would listen." He took a ragged breath. "You tried to save him. You tried to save all of us. That counts for something. It counts for everything to us." He tapped the box with a thick, calloused finger. "This is for the life you tried to save, for having the courage to speak a truth that no one wanted to hear. It doesn't exist on any record, but it exists for us, and it exists for him." Ava looked from the medal to the face of the grieving warrior. The cold stone of guilt in her stomach didn't vanish, but it was joined by something else, something warm and fragile, a sense of absolution. It wasn't from command. It was from the men who had been there, the men who understood the cost. It was a validation of her skill, her judgment, and her attempt to prevent the tragedy. She nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. Master Sergeant Donovan gave her a slow, solemn nod in return, a gesture of respect that meant more than any official commendation. Then he turned and walked away, leaving her alone with the weight of the small velvet box, a sacred token from a battle brother to a sister in arms, a silent testament to a debt that could only be repaid in honor. The story hung in the air of the interrogation room, a tangible thing now, thick with the dust of Afghanistan and the scent of loss. Fletcher stared at the small blue box, its meaning utterly transformed. It was no longer a piece of suspicious contraband. It was a reliquary. The sterile, accusatory atmosphere had evaporated, replaced by a heavy, respectful silence. He could almost hear the ghostly echo of the Black Hawk's rotors, the frantic radio traffic from the kill zone, the final, devastating blast. He looked from the metal to Captain Rostova. The mask of the stoic officer had finally slipped, and the raw, enduring grief of the young linguist from Kunar was now visible in the slight tremor of her lower lip, the sheen of unshed tears in her gray eyes. Agent Miller, the younger investigator, shifted uncomfortably in his seat. The legalistic framework of their inquiry, protocols, regulations, chains of custody, seemed grotesquely inadequate, even offensive, in the face of this story. This wasn't a breach of military law. It was a testament to a law that ran deeper, the unwritten code of brotherhood and the brutal, personal cost of being right when it mattered most and being ignored. Fletcher slowly reached out and closed the lid of the velvet box. The soft click was a period at the end of Eva's sentence. He didn't slide it into an evidence bag. Instead, he pushed it gently back across the cold steel table, returning it to its keeper. "Captain Rostova," Fletcher said, his voice low and stripped of all its earlier authority. It was just the voice of one soldier speaking to another. We were operating under a different set of assumptions." He paused, choosing his words with a care he hadn't shown before. "The nature of your work in Syria, the secrecy." It raised flags. "We were looking for a leak. We thought we'd find something that compromised national security." He gestured weakly to the box. "We found something that compromises a person instead, in a different way." Eva looked at the box, then back at Fletcher. The defiance was gone, replaced by a profound and weary resignation. "The security of my soul was compromised a long time ago, Agent Fletcher. The day I watched good men fly into an ambush, I predicted. This," she said, her hand resting lightly on the velvet, "is just the receipt." She took a slow, shaky breath. "Liam Crow received a Silver Star for his actions that day. It's in a case at his parents' house in Ohio. It's a comfort to them, and it's what the world sees. This is what we see. The team. Me. It's the medal for the truth that didn't make the report, for the action that happened before the first shot was ever fired." Fletcher simply nodded. There were no more questions. The investigation was over. The file in his mind, once filled with suspicions and flagged inconsistencies, was now closed and replaced by a single searing image, a young woman in a dusty shack, screaming a warning into the indifferent wind, and the profound act of grace from the men who, in their own deepest loss, took the time to absolve her. The weight in the room was no longer the weight of accusation, but the shared heavy burden of military service, of decisions made and lives lost, of silent heroes and their unseen wounds. He looked at his partner, Miller, and gave a slight, almost imperceptible shake of his head. The message was clear. We are done here. We are in the presence of something we have no jurisdiction over. The silence stretched, but it was no longer hostile. It was a quiet space of understanding, a moment of shared remembrance for a sacrifice that had nothing to do with the two investigators and everything to do with the woman sitting before them. Fletcher slowly pushed his chair back, the legs scraping softly against the linoleum floor. The sound was gentle, a deliberate contrast to the harsh zipper that had begun this ordeal. He stood up, his movements no longer those of an interrogator, but of a man humbled by a story far greater than his authority. He walked around the steel table, his shadow falling over the scattered contents of the backpack. He didn't look at the dog-eared book or the spare uniform. His eyes were on the small blue box. He stopped beside Eva's chair. She didn't look up at him. Her gaze was fixed on her hands, now folded in her lap. She seemed smaller somehow, the weight of her confession having momentarily collapsed the proud posture of a captain. Fletcher bent down, his movements slow and non-threatening. He carefully picked up the sock that had once swaddled the box and began with a surprising tenderness to re-wrap the velvet case. He tucked the folds of the black fabric around it, creating a protective cushion, just as she had done. He then began to gather her other belongings. He placed the novel back into the main compartment, followed by the water bottle and the first aid kit. He picked up her spare uniform and for a moment he held it, feeling the sturdy fabric, smelling the faint, lingering scent of a faraway desert. It was the uniform of a soldier who had served with quiet dedication, whose battles were often fought in the shadows of intelligence reports and intercepted communications. He folded it neatly, not with the crisp, regimented corners of a parade ground, but with the respectful care of one who understands the value of the things a soldier carries home. He placed it gently on top of the other items in the pack. Finally, he picked up the wrapped metal. He held it in his palm for a long moment, feeling its symbolic weight. This small object held more honor, more raw truth, than any official commendation he had ever processed. He leaned forward and placed it back into the backpack, nestling it securely in the very center where it belonged. He straightened up and looked down at Eva. "Captain," he said, his voice firm but quiet. "You are free to go." He didn't say anything else. No apologies, no platitudes. They would have been insulting. The return of her possessions, the care with which he had handled them, was the only apology that mattered. It was a silent restoration of her dignity. Eva slowly raised her head. The sheen of tears was gone, replaced by a deep, weary resilience. She looked from her repacked backpack to Fletcher's face. She saw no judgment there, only a grim and earned respect. She gave a single, sharp nod of acknowledgement. It was all that was needed. She stood up, her body protesting the long hours of tension. She reached for the backpack, her fingers brushing the coarse fabric. Slinging it over one shoulder, she felt its familiar weight settle against her back. It was lighter now, the poison of suspicion drained from it. It once again held only her history, her grief, and her strange private metal. She turned without another word and walked towards the door, her footsteps echoing in the quiet room. Fletcher and Miller watched her go, two men who had come to judge a potential traitor and instead had borne witness to a quiet, unsung kind of heroism. The sunlight outside the building was startlingly bright, a stark and almost painful contrast to the windowless interrogation room. Captain Eva Rostova paused on the steps, blinking as her eyes adjusted. The air was clean here, smelling of cut grass and damp concrete, a world away from the scents of dust, cordite, and sterile antiseptic that had filled her senses for so long. She shifted the weight of the backpack on her shoulder, feeling the familiar shape of the velvet box press against her back through the canvas. It was no longer a secret burning a hole in her pack. It was a part of her, as integrated as the memory it represented. She began to walk, her boots making soft, solid sounds on the pavement. Each step away from the building felt like a step further out of a cage. They had emptied her backpack, searching for evidence of a traitor, and had instead found the heart of a soldier. They had expected to find stolen secrets or illicit cash, and they had found a treasure far more valuable. A story of loyalty that transcended regulations. A medal forged not by a government mint, but by grief and gratitude. The investigation was over, but her mission, the one given to her by a grieving master sergeant in the dust of Afghanistan, was eternal. It was the mission of remembrance. She thought of Liam Crow, not as the hero who jumped on a grenade, but as the man with the easy smile who saluted a linguist in a plywood shack. She thought of his parents in Ohio, their son's official silver star displayed proudly in their home. They had the comfort of a nation's gratitude, and she had this, her private, unsanctioned, and infinitely more personal tribute. Some heroes receive public parades, their names etched in stone for all to see. Their valor is broadcast, their sacrifice universally acknowledged. It was a necessary and beautiful thing. But other heroes, she knew, carried their recognition in a different way. Their battles were fought in the shadows, their victories were silent, and their losses were quiet, personal earthquakes that rarely registered on anyone else's scale. Their medals were not pinned to their chests by a general before a cheering crowd. They were pressed into their hands in a moment of raw, shared pain by the only people who would ever truly understand the cost. They were the ones who bore the weight of foresight, the burden of a truth told too soon and heard too late. She reached her car and unlocked it, sliding into the driver's seat but not starting the engine. She simply sat for a moment in the quiet, the backpack resting on the passenger seat beside her. She was going home. There would be no debriefing about this, no notation in her file about the mysterious medal. It would remain her secret, and the secret of the men who gave it to her. It was a hidden chapter in the history of a war that was, for most people, already fading into the past. But for her, it was as present as the weight of the box. It was a reminder that courage came in many forms. Sometimes it was the courage to charge a hill, and sometimes it was the courage to stand your ground and speak an unwelcome truth, to live with the consequences, and to carry the memory of the fallen long after the official ceremonies had ended. She started the car and pulled away, leaving the military complex behind. She was driving back into the world, a soldier carrying her own unique standard of honor, a quiet testament to the fact that the truest recognition often exists not in the light of public acclaim, but in the quiet, steadfast chambers of the human heart.